Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to get us started for the day. Thank you to everyone for being here. Board members, remember you need to sign in both days. So if you haven't signed in at some point today before you leave, just make sure that you're checked off today so that your time can get entered into the system and you get the credit for being here. And if you're an attorney and want CLE credit, there's a separate sign-in sheet for that. So sign in, and when the CLE credit gets approved, Amy will send you an email so that you have everything you need for your reporting. Yesterday, there were several comments made from different presenters about DHS not meeting the federal standards, or DHS sliding back. So I've had a few questions, so I just wanted to kind of give everybody the quick 2-minute overview of what that means, okay? There's a federal review. It's called the Child and Family Services Review. You probably hear it referred to as CFSR. Oregon is in the process of doing the third CFSR. CFSR started back in 2001, and Oregon had a CFSR review in 2001. Round 2 for Oregon was in 2008, and we're currently doing round 3. The CFSR has 3 components. The first component is a self-assessment. In that self-assessment, there are about 38 different items, and Oregon needs to report to the federal government how they're doing on each of those items. The self-assessment includes a lot of data, as well as interviews and survey reports and those kinds of things. This year, the self-assessment is the report that was just published, and that's the report that has been in the news about DHS sliding in the wrong direction and not meeting federal standards. That report is 133 pages long. We'll send that to you when we send you the link, so that you can take a look at that if you're interested. We'll send you a link to the report when we send you the link to the evaluation form, okay? The second component of the CFSR is an on-site review. The federal review team will be in Oregon the last week in May, and they have interviews scheduled with various stakeholders as well as DHS child welfare staff and management. During those interviews, they gather a bunch of additional information. So they've looked at the self-assessment report, and they will come to us with questions. They've asked me to put together a group of judges, CRB members, and CASAs to talk specifically about services and case plans. So I'm arranging for that group of people to meet with the federal auditors when they're here. The third component of the CFSR is a file review. And they've randomly selected 120 cases, I think from about 10 to 12 different counties in the state. And they spent a team of 2 people will review everything in the case. They also do interviews with parents, children, foster parents, caseworkers, supervisors, to really get an understanding of everything in the case, and they have a very detailed checklist of things that they're marking off. The file review component this year, the states were given the option of being able to do that component by themselves or having the federal review team do it. Oregon chose to do the file review ourselves. With that decision, they sought out, and we gave them 5 of our staff people who are assisting in those file reviews. Each file review takes about a week. It's that detailed. And Christina, Sherry, Connor, John, and Dave are all participating in assisting with those file reviews with a DHS staff person. So round 3 is not completed yet. The final report will include information from the self-assessment, the on-site review team meeting as well as the file review. And that won't be published until probably late this year or very early January 2017. So just wanted you to know that the state is in this review process. From the self-assessment, they're saying that we're sliding in the wrong direction, and the review isn't complete. So you'll be hearing more about this over the next 6 months or so. Yeah. There, primarily, the consequence is that the agency will be required to put together a PIP, a Program Improvement Plan. So they'll need to work with stakeholders and staff to develop a PIP for any of the areas that they're not in substantial conformity with. And we have in the past assisted them with putting together that PIP and doing what we can do to help get them into compliance. So I'm sure we will be at the table with that. If they don't meet the requirements of their PIP within a certain amount of time, and I think it's about 2 years, then yes, there could be financial penalties. Okay, so that's the CFSR. If you hear about it, that's what folks are thinking. That's what folks are talking about. Amy Benedum is here, and she is she's a former field manager. She's currently working on our JSIP staff and working with our Juvenile and Family Court Programs Division on a variety of different projects working with the trial courts. And she's also the staff person for the CAPTA program this year. So Amy is going to give you a little report on that.
I'm going to be brief because I hate speaking into a microphone in front of a large group. It's awful. So the CAPTA program, I don't know if everybody knows what the CAPTA program is. The CAPTA stands for the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which was a federal act. Part of what CAPTA required was that every state create 3 citizen review panels to address an issue that they identified in child welfare and to make recommendations to DHS. And so the CAPTA panels have been under the CRB umbrella since 2012. This last year, we had 3 CAPTA panels in Multnomah County, Lane County, and Douglas County. The CAPTA panels meet in July. We call it a kickoff meeting where they hear from DHS, they get together, they talk about some issues that they're noticing in their county, and they pick one area of focus. And this last year, for the first time since we've been doing the CAPTA panels, all 3 CAPTA panels from these 3 counties went into their separate rooms, spent about 3 hours picking their topic, came together, and discovered that they had all picked the exact same topic, which was really quite interesting. The topic that they all picked was the recruitment, retention, and support of foster parents. And I think everyone in this room can understand why that is incredibly important. Over the last 2 years, DHS has lost over 400 foster homes. So in a lot of counties, there really is a crisis of a lack of appropriate foster homes. Kids are not going into homes that are well matched to them. Kids are going into homes that are temporary emergency placements that turn into long-term placements, and it really is having an effect on the system, on the kids, on the foster parents, on everybody. So the 3 counties started working in July. They worked through April. Multnomah County and Lane County developed a survey for foster parents, and the survey was completed by 264 foster parents statewide, which was, I thought, a really good response rate. Lane County conducted focus groups. They had 2 different focus groups. One group was for foster parents who were therapeutic foster parents. One group was for foster parents who weren't. They spoke to 24 different foster parents, asking them for their feedback, their input, what was working well for them, what wasn't working well for them. Douglas did some interviews with various stakeholders in the community to get a sense of what the situation was exactly in Douglas. And then all 3 counties developed recommendations. A lot of the recommendations had some overlap, so I'm just going to not really attribute the recommendations to each county, but go over what the recommendations for the state as a whole were. The first recommendation is the DHS needs to have somebody on staff who is really dedicated to being a support person for the foster parents. A lot of the foster parents surveyed said that the person they felt most supported by was their foster parent certifier, which is excellent. That's the person who had the first relationship with them. But that there were a lot of questions and issues that came up, and they didn't really have anyone to call to ask the questions as they came up. And so we felt that having someone on staff who was really dedicated to recruiting foster parents, retaining foster parents, supporting foster parents, developing specific trainings to foster parents as they heard feedback from people that these are issues. Some foster parents, for example, said, reactive attachment disorder, I could really use some training on that. So these are some of the things that we thought person in this position could do. Also, respite care was a huge issue that was identified. Foster parents really need respite care. It's incumbent on them to identify their respite care providers, to find the people, to arrange for these people to provide respite care. And so most of them don't ever get respite care. So the panels would like to see DHS putting together a list of certified respite care providers and then making that list available to foster parents. And the suggestion was that these respite care providers should be listed by CANS level. So if you have a child who has a CANS level of 3, you're going to need a very specific type of respite care provider. And so DHS should be helping foster parents to at least identify who those people in the community are. Another thing that foster parents brought up was grief. When kids are removed from their home, oftentimes they don't get a lot of notice from DHS. Oftentimes these children have been in their home for years. They love these children. These children are part of the family. And then these children are removed. One foster parent shared that she dropped a child off for a visit with the parents, and the caseworker called her and said, the child's just going to stay home. Can you pack up their things and bring it to a parking lot? And so she dropped the child's belongings off in a parking lot and never heard from DHS again about that child, never got to say goodbye to that child, and that's traumatic. So we want DHS, the panels want DHS to develop some closure procedures. A foster parent said one time DHS, when a child was removed from her home and went home, the caseworker sent her a letter and just said, thank you so much, for what you did for this child. We appreciate it. I took the child home. Things are looking great. I just want to say thank you. And she said that just meant so much to her. So it doesn't always have to be as intensive as grief counseling, but some sort of acknowledgement and process and wrap up from DHS, acknowledging that these foster parents have a connection to these children and that their family's experiencing grief and loss when the children go home, or leave. Another issue, and I think we heard a little bit about this in one of the sessions, Lane County really wants DHS to do a cost-benefit analysis of getting caseworkers smartphones, which are phones that can text. A lot of caseworkers out in the field do not have access to phones that can text. And that is difficult because foster parents report that it's very hard to get in touch with the caseworkers. And as we know, caseworkers are out in the field a lot. They're rarely sitting at their office there to answer their phone. And so if you're a foster parent, getting a call back in 24 hours can be really, really difficult. And a lot of the issues that they're having need a response quickly. So that was a big recommendation for DHS. And then the last two really have to do with funding. The first is that the base rate reimbursement payments for foster parents was reduced in January 2012 due to budget issues. It hasn't been increased since. And that, what we heard overwhelmingly from survey responders and focus group respondents is that the base rate reimbursement will cover some of the costs of a child, but it doesn't come close to covering all of the costs for a child. And daycare especially was highlighted, that if you have a foster child in your home who needs daycare, the foster parent needs to pay for the entire expense of that, and that can be prohibitively expensive. There were several respondents who said things like, we have one foster child, we would love to take in another, but we're spending $1,000 a month on daycare and we can't afford $2,000 a month. You're asking that? I don't have that in front of me. It's done by age. The lowest base rate is somewhere around $580 for younger children, and I believe it goes up to about $740, $50 for teens. So increasing the base rate of foster payments was a recommendation from the Multnomah County, and then a recommendation from Lane County was to provide a child care subsidy for some foster parents who need it. And the idea there is that the cost of child care shouldn't be an impediment to someone being a foster parent. So those are... Oh, and then the last recommendation is just to update foster parent trainings. What we heard from foster parents is that there's a lot of trainings online, but they're the same trainings year after year after year. So if you've been a foster parent for several years, you don't really have new trainings, access to new trainings. So they would love to see some new trainings. They'd love to see some creative ways to access trainings, both online, in person, maybe some online support groups for foster parents. So these are just some of the suggestions from the panels. I want to say thank you very much to the board members. I'm not going to make them stand up, but I know some of them are in this room. They worked very, very hard on these panels. It's a lot of work, and they were really, really dedicated. And I think when you take all these recommendations as a whole, I think it really does offer a solid base of recommendations to improve recruitment, retention, and support for foster parents. Yes. Yes, that's where the texting suggestion came from on the fathers panel, that people today, especially younger people, text quite a bit, and so having phones that can text. I did hear from DHS it would be very, very expensive to put all of their caseworkers on that kind of a data plan, so I don't know what the funding is going to look like, but that's a recommendation. And I just want to give a quick little update. We have selected the location for the 3 panels for this coming year. We're continuing in Multnomah County. We're going to be in Benton County, and for the first time, we're going to be in the Umatilla-Moro community. And we will be, Leola and I will be heading out to each of those 3 counties in July and August to have the kickoff meeting for stakeholders and panel members in those counties to pick their topic areas.
Amy,
Yes.
what happens once the recommendations are being made? Do you follow up?
Yes, so the recommendations, I wrote a report that I believe is now finalized. I've sent it out to the panel members for their input, so I have a few edits to make. The report then gets sent to DHS, and DHS reads through the recommendations, and they have, I believe, 6 months to respond to each of the recommendations from the panels. I don't have the exact number, but I believe they have implemented many of the recommendations from previous panels. So they've been pretty responsive to the work of the CAPTA panels. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.
Additionally, the CAPTA report goes in the federal report that DHS has to file with the feds every year. So the Region 10 folks in Washington, in the state of Washington, they frequently ask DHS what is the status of the CAPTA recommendations. So there is oversight from that end as well. This morning, Dr. Tracy Powell, who's one of our board members, and I don't see her. She's in Polk County. There she is. She's a professor at Western Oregon University. She came up to me and said, I was checking my email last night, and there was an email that was sent out from the university to all of the, I think, faculty and students, letting them know that they're putting together a special program, and they're looking for people who are interested in being kind of supports and kind of mentors for foster children who are entering the university in the fall. So she said, I signed up. So I said, yay, good for you and good for Western Oregon for doing something like that. As we saw yesterday in the homelessness presentation, that support is really needed for young people who age out of foster care. So we have Gina Baines and Rhea Kramer here with us today. They're doing a session called The Voices of Poverty, and this is an overview of the realities of living in poverty and how to overcome the barriers professionals often encounter when working with this population. Many of the families, as you know, in the child welfare system are living in poverty or come from families within the poverty guidelines. The Casey Family Foundation reported that 1 in 4 children in the U.S. live in low-income households, and about 22% of U.S. children live below the poverty line. Poverty affects every aspect of a family's life, and the effects of poverty are widespread and often difficult to overcome. Gina grew up in generational poverty, and that experience shaped the work she does today as the Social Services Director at St. Vincent de Paul in Oak Ridge. Gina is also a certified Poverty 101 trainer and has over 15 years of professional experience working in the social service field with a primary focus on working with people in poverty. Gia and her children, including her daughter Ria, are the first members of their family to graduate from college and break the cycle of abuse, drug addiction, and poverty. Ria attended the University of Oregon, where she received her bachelor's degree in Family and Human Services and her master's degree in Early Childhood Special Education. She's worked as a child educator at First Place Family Center preschool program, and she's worked for the Options Counseling Services as a family builder, providing home visit services, and case management services for family preservation of children involved in the child welfare system. She currently serves as the university supervisory in the Family and Human Services program at the University of Oregon and teaches courses on generational poverty and addictions. And they're right here. I'm looking over there, but you're here. Welcome.
So can everyone hear me okay? Good. So Amy, where are you in the crowd? You just spoke. I just want to say I also am a mother of 6 children. I had 3 biological children, and I adopted 3 children and dealt with the foster care system. I was a foster parent first and then adopted. So it was like being in church over here. Everything you said, all of the obstacles, challenges, and how we need support is 100% true. Because if you don't get it, you get burnt out. Especially if you have kids that have, the drug addiction or attachment disorder, and you're kind of handed these kiddos, and you get no education on what all these titles mean. So I just want to say thank you for saying all that, because you're 100% nailed it on the head of what we need to find families that will keep children, and also find therapeutic families to help these kids overcome the trauma they've experienced. So I'll say thank you to that, and then I'll start my story. So I was born in Klamath Falls, and I have a mom, dad, a sister, and 3 brothers. My dad was schizophrenic and never was medicated, so what that means is he had a lot of episodes where he was paranoid, thought the government was after us, would pull his guns out a lot, clean it in the house. He would barricade the front room and teach us how to army crawl, so if bullets came in the house, we wouldn't be shot. Both of my parents were alcoholics. So it was a pretty rough family, to say the least. And my mother was also physically abusive to my older siblings. And it was to the point where my sister, when she was about 14 years old, she couldn't handle the abuse anymore from my mother. So she started doing criminal activity to get arrested to get out of the house, because being incarcerated it was much better than the environment that we were in. So when I was 4, my sister was arrested, put into a girls' home, and around that same time, we had a lot of family members in Klamath Falls that saw the neglect that we were under. We went without food. We were usually pretty filthy. Our house was where the Hells Angels came, and our front yard would be full of motorcycles, and they would shower and bathe and hang out. Some of my best memories was with that motorcycle gang, because they value family, they value kids, but what they don't value is they talk about drugs, violence, and their criminal activity in front of kids. So you get to hear about people they shot or stabbed or whatever was going on, but it was a good time because they were always nice to kids, and they would always bring lots of food to our house. So, but around that time, my mom started getting a lot of abuse reports. And this is what I'm assuming, because the family said literally overnight she packed us up into our cars, 2 cars, And we moved. We hit the road and just started driving around and camping out and staying in the woods and different places. So we were allowed to take a few clothes. I remember taking a couple Barbies, and that was it. So we started driving around. We found a place by Hines Burns, Oregon, in the desert, and that is where we lived. And another thing that happens when you get a lot of abuse charges or you have DHS breathing down your neck a lot is you don't take your kids to doctors. It's not that you don't love your kids. It's not that you're not worried about your kids. You are more worried about your child being taken away, and you're more worried about judgment than you are about the injury that they have sometimes. So when we lived in this desert, we would go to town once a month when we got our Social Security check because my father was on disability. And we would get supplies. And that would last the first 2 weeks of the month, but on the end of the month, there was never any money. So we would be out of food. And we were camping right next to a rest area, and families would come in. I remember it's the first time I really felt like I was on the outside looking in. I would see these nice cars come with all these kids, and we were all excited because we knew when they left, they would leave all this food. So we would go to the garbage cans and get all the food out that they would leave and take it back home and eat it. My brothers also, they were 11 and 12. They learned how to trap, hunt. We've ate snake. Anything in the desert, we've pretty much ate. And that's how we would live towards the end of the month. If the dog still had food and we didn't, we would soak it in water, make patties, and fry up the dog food, and that's what we also would eat. So it was a pretty, not a lot of great memories out in the desert. It's not a fun place to be when you're a kid. It's hot. It's just not a fun place, and there's no place to bathe except the sinks and the rest areas. So also, you have no toys. So my brother, when he would kill squirrels, he would make Barbie clothes for me. He used to have these he'd have these skinned squirrels up on his board and make a fur wrap for my Barbie. And so I would go to the rest area and take their paper towels and their toilet paper and make like little dresses and wraps. And so we were a pretty creative family on how we played. And one of the things we would do is I would wrap this rope around my brother. And there's nothing better than feeling hot sand go through your toes and fingers and feet. And so he used to drag me through the sand, and he'd be my horsey. And this one time, a broken off beer bottle went up my foot and just sliced it. So again, of course, I would not go to the doctor. I laid in the back of the station wagon, and my family would take turns shooing the flies from my foot so I wouldn't get maggots in my foot. And so finally, my father, typically my father paced back and forth, talked to himself a lot. He hit his head a lot. He was in a lot of pain. And so the reason of sanity came from this man. And he said, Karen, Gina is going to lose her foot if we do not get her to a doctor. And that was finally when my mom decided to pack us all up. I didn't go to a doctor, but we did hit the road to find a town. And we started driving, and we came to Oak Ridge, Oregon, which is a rural community in the woods. I think my mom felt pretty safe there with her kids because there's no reporting. Everybody minds their own business. There was one doctor in town. My mom was also very much into herbs and stuff like that. I mean, she was always making some crazy paste. You know, if your arm is falling off, she'll make some, oatmeal paste to be put on it. So I remember my foot being pasted and wrapped and stuff, and we went to this town. And the only place that we could afford that we got was these apartments. And this was an old logging community, so they always had these apartments that had like one bathroom and 6 apartments. And that's what we moved into. So very high poverty apartments, but we were just excited that we had running water, we had a toilet. It was only 1 bedroom, and all of us slept in it. And we just had beds and cots lined up. But we were just excited to be around kids and see people and not be isolated. But this also was a pretty dangerous place to live. Kitty corner from our apartment is where the prostitutes lived. I wasn't allowed to bathe in the bathtub because that's where they took their johns and did their business. So I still had to bathe in a sink, but it was a bigger sink. It was a kitchen sink. And I was in first grade, so I fit perfectly into it. it was still very embarrassing because I had all brothers. I was the only girl bathing in the kitchen sink. And then down the street, or down the hallway from there was the domestic violence family. So that's the family where mom, usually on the weekend, was being hauled off and she was beaten and bloody. Dad was being arrested. And back then, they would just leave the kids at home. There's a teenage boy, and he'd be in charge of all the kids. And so my mom was typically the mom that said, oh, well, come down to our house. You guys can stay at our house. And so we would have all these traumatized kids coming to our house and wondering what was going to happen with mom, if she was going to be okay. And so that was my first experience living. And like 3 blocks down was some kids. So I did find kids in the neighborhood. But I didn't really experience a neighborhood, having friends, and meeting kids until we moved when I was in the 2nd grade. And when I went to school, when you go to school and you do not act the same way as other kids, you smell. When we had animals, they would urinate in the house, and my mom would just sweep it in a corner. Or we had what was called a piss mop. So I could imagine how I smelled when I went to school. I wasn't very welcomed. Matter of fact, when you don't eat at home and you go to school, in the morning time, when you're real young like that, it's a little bit better when you're older, but when you're young like that, you're really antsy. You can't sit still, you can't focus because you're thinking about recess, you're thinking about lunch, and you're antsy and just, I remember that anxiety, which I wouldn't, back then, you don't know it's anxiety, you're a child. So, and then after you eat lunch, what happens is your whole body calms down, you're relaxed, you're lethargic basically, and you don't want to really participate. So when I was in 1st grade, before I went to 2nd grade, I had this teacher. First I had a counselor who knew what was going on in my home or suspected it. So she thought she would help me out and try and prove I was abused by bringing me into the bathroom at the elementary school. I would stand like this, and she would have me stripped down naked, and she would check me for bruises or any markings of abuse. She would ask me questions, which by that age, I was already groomed to lie. Of course my parents don't drink. No, I've never seen a fight. You know, and I remember even throwing good stories in there, which I would have loved to hear what my perspective of a good story was coming from where I came from. But, you know, I knew how to sell myself. I knew how to lie. Because the most important thing my mother taught us is we have to stay together. You have to lie because you have to stay together. That's the most important thing. If you tell anybody this, you will never see us again. That's the message you get when you're a child and you live in that. So at the same time, I also had this teacher that after lunch, I remember laying my head down because you're just so tired. And one of the kids said, "Teacher, should we wake her up? She's sleeping again." And her response was, "No, it's not like she does any work anyway." And I remember a defining moment thinking, oh, this is what I have to do for her to leave me alone. And so I can't help but think, but you know, that was a coping mechanism I think I started at a very young age, is to be non-responsive. And so I finally went on to the 2nd grade and got this wonderful 2nd grade teacher, very nurturing. She'd have snacks for me at her desk that she would sneak me. Back then, you did not have breakfast in school, so you have to go all day long to lunch. I think that she recognized I was hungry. And I also did very well in her classroom, and I know it was because I had some snacks and I had some extra support. Now, in the 2nd grade is also when we had a pretty traumatic event in our household. My brother, Gordon, which I'll say my family's name, but I don't refer much to them because they're so confusing. The birth order in my family is Geraldine, Gerald, Gerald, Gordon, and Gina. And Gerald and Gerald are only 11 months apart. So I almost say brother 1, 2, and 3. So my brother, who was 3rd in line, Gordon, he was 3 years older than me, we finally moved to this neighborhood where there was a park, we could go play. I didn't initially make a lot of friends, but I met a girl who was my age but a grade above me. She took me under her wing. Her sister used to make fun of me and bully me. So she would come to my house, and no one ever wanted to come into my house. And she'd say, no, it's okay, Gina, I'll come into your house. My dad was a pretty scary fellow. All his teeth were black, rotten out of his face. He would talk to himself, and he would laugh. He was always laughing, but that's, I'm sure, very creepy for a young kid to be around someone talking to himself laughing. And she said, it's okay, I don't care how your dad is. And so she came in, I showed her my room, and she taught me how to ride a bike. She taught me my left hand from right, and she started taking her sister's clothes and giving them to me, which didn't go over too well. But when her sister Wendy would grow out of her clothes, I was tiny enough, even though I was 2 years younger than Wendy, I was tiny enough that when she grew out of her clothes, I could get her hand-me-downs. Now, to me, the only clothes I got was my brother's hand-me-downs, so I was pretty excited to get any hand-me-downs. So Laura started giving me Wendy's hand-me-downs, and she'd pick me up early before the school bus, take me to her house, and do my hair, and she's the one that taught me how to brush my hair, and that's when I found out you're supposed to brush your teeth. And when we got toilet paper in our house, which wasn't very often, I used it for Barbie clothes. I made my Barbie clothes out of it. So I learned a lot of things, not by her saying, Gina, this is toothpaste, this is what you do, but by going and hanging out with the girls in the morning before school and having her be very nice to me. She's the one that connected me to other friends. And then once I had friends that were in my grade and stuff, she kind of went on her own way, but she was my first mentor. And around that same time, my brother Gordon was in our neighborhood park, swinging back and forth on a rope, and the rope went up and killed him instantly. It choked him, broke his neck. So we were in a neighborhood. There was families around. We had more support from other kids in the neighborhood. But you have to realize this neighborhood also was full of everybody in that neighborhood was either on Social Security or they were on, back then it was called welfare. We only knew two dads in the whole neighborhood, and they would go to work, but we didn't know what work was. I never knew anyone who had a job. I had no concept of how you get money or how you work. But what's so great about a poverty neighborhood is you all feed each other. When something like this happens, you all pull together. I had lots of moms that took care of me because my mom shut down, totally shut down. So around that time, I had that wonderful second grade teacher. My mom wouldn't let me leave the house. She was scared to let me out of her sight. But Mrs. Gilson came to my house on a regular basis. And I remember climbing on the back of the couch. She had about this much room. My brother would crack the door like that far. And she would bring food. She brought me a turtle with a little plant in it. She'd bring me toys. And every day I'd get on the back of the couch, sticking my head in the window, hi, or I'd stick an arm out so she knew I was there. But every day she was like, Karen, can Gina come to school today? Karen, can Gina come to school today? And then finally my mom was like, yeah, I'll let her go back to school. And I don't know how long it was, but for me it seemed like it was a very long time before I was allowed to go back to school. And my mom would just sit there with no emotion, she was totally shut down. When I went back to school, she teamed me up with this kid I had a crush on. It was a friend of mine's older brother, so it was like really exciting. But Chad was his name. And he just followed me around and talked with me a lot, read to me. And I think she just teamed me up with him because I would imagine I was pretty pulled in too. And so the rest of the school year, I had this aide that just did work with me and hung out with me during circle time. And, and briefly after that, I also met a lady that I call my Aunt Marie, which I have not been doing my slides. I apologize. We lived, and I just briefly want to go through this, what the war zone of poverty is. Living from crisis to crisis, being bullied at school because you don't look the same, you don't talk the same, and it's not just from children. Bullying would not be happening in our schools if we had adults that would take care of it when they heard it or saw it or thought a different way about the kids they're serving. I had just as many teachers that did not want to sit by me or work with me as the kids. I had teachers I would go sit by that moved away from me, and I know it was because of my smell. But we have to start valuing people more than that concept of if they smell or not. Or I'm sure I was a difficult child. I won't put that past me. I was very spirited my whole life. So, and parenting out of survival. I have no doubt if my mother had the supports that she had, that she would not have been physically abusive to my older siblings. I think she was put beyond her measure of what she could handle. A mentally ill husband, a bunch of wild kids, and the fear of losing her family. So I, in second grade, met my friends. I met Aunt Marie, is what I called her. She's a lady who was in our neighborhood visiting one of her friends. And I'm blind in my left eye because I never received medical attention. And if you do not get medical attention for a lazy eye before the age of 8, you lose your vision in that eye. Your brain shuts off that use. So I ran into a lot of stuff when I was a kid. When I learned how to ride a bike, I hit a lot of fences. I can't tell distance. So I'm running through the parking lot, and I almost ran into this big GMC truck, which is just amazing that I almost hit it. But so this lady gets down like this and grabs me up, and she said, we just sat there and giggled, and she said, so what's your name? And of course, I told her my name, where I lived, who my parents were, and gave her all my information. She went to my mother's house and hired her to be her maid full-time and work under the table. She also pretty much adopted me and bought the best school clothes you can imagine throughout school. Any sports fee, any cheerleading stuff, anything I wanted to do, she paid for. She also taught me how to can and cook. She had 80 acres up in the hills in Oak Ridge, and so we would go up there. I spent all summer and every weekend up there. But what also happened between this mentorship between me and her is also this mentorship, an unspoken mentorship between my mother and her. And that was, I started seeing that people did things a lot different. And I saw that with my friends and stuff, but to be in that situation where it's two women together canning and quilting, and you hear all these conversations, I really started seeing that our family was different. And that's when I like to say I became my early therapist, because I started saying, why? And so one of the things Aunt Marie did, it was always, you're beautiful, Gina. You're such a sweetheart. I love you. And she would say it to her son, too, which was also my age. And I remember saying to my mom, Mom, how come you never say I love you? And she says, well, it's just hard to say. And so I went to bed that night. I'm lying there, and I yell out. I said, good night, Mom, I love you. And there's like a pause. And I go, and what do you say? And she goes, I love you too, Gina. Go to bed. That was the beginning of my mom always saying, I love you. She noticed my aunt would take me, got my ears pierced, and would buy me jewelry. She called me a princess. And if anyone knows me, they know I'm a princess. So, and I know I got that from her. So my mom caught on to that. She started buying me jewelry. She started buying me cute little candles, telling me I was special. And her idea of affection when I was younger, she called me her turd in her pocket, because I followed her everywhere. But she started saying nicer things to me, like, you're my sunshine. Or if I remember asking where I came from, and she'd either say she found me in the toilet or she found me in a Cabbage Patch, which was funny because later Cabbage Patch dolls came out years later. So my mother just had to really learn how to show affection. Now, we had affection. I always cuddled to my mom. I slept with my mom till I was about 16. We'd watch movies together, eat junk food, and always cuddled. But I don't think that would have developed if she didn't have that modeling. And that's what mentorship is. It's not just telling someone how to do something. It's just having those friendships and those connections where you show people how to do things. And so that was my experience in second grade. So although I had a lot of trauma in that age group, I also had a lot of things that was building resiliency in me. Very at risk, but I had the right things at the right time, all working together to help me through that phase. She is passed away at this time. We have a documentary. Oh, she was in a girls' home. So real quick, I want to say all of my siblings have been incarcerated. I'm the only one that's never been incarcerated or arrested. I'm the only one that's never been through drug treatment in a mental institution or in a jail. And I mean for generations, not just, that's through our whole family. And then my children are the only ones for their generation. So I have nieces and nephews. It either goes two ways. They get in a mental institution or they get in jail. So at that time, she was incarcerated till she was 18. So I'm going to skip forward to the teen years. Because what happens when kids who experience trauma as a young child hit puberty years, I like to say all hell breaks loose because that's the only way you can explain it. So at the time, I didn't feel that for myself, but now that I've adopted kids who experience trauma, boy, it's a different ballgame when hormones are coming in the picture. So when I went through puberty, I had this self-concept, even though I was told these great things by my aunt, I had this self-concept that I wasn't lovable. Nobody would want me. I'm not a pretty girl. And so when men started showing me attention, I just thought, wow, they think I'm pretty, like they think I'm smart. And so needless to say, I was a teen mother. And real briefly, I'll go through. So I got pregnant at the age of 14. My son died at birth at the age of 15. I got pregnant again at 15. I had my daughter at 16. I had another son at 19 and another son at 23. Now, what I want to say real briefly is 14, when I became sexually active, I went to our local clinic to get on birth control. And I was told that they would not give me birth control because it stunts the growth. It stunts your platelets when you're on birth control that young. And I was given condoms and foam. So I just want, and thank God they don't do that anymore. And they have more education now than what they did back then about your reproductive system, how babies are made. I mean, you kind of know. When I asked how babies were made, you don't need to know, you don't do it, period. That's the information I got. So, and that's a whole nother story I won't jump into. But I did get married at 16 when I got pregnant with my daughter. The man I married was a youth pastor in a church, and he was very abusive. Very charismatic guy, groomed me very well to be who he wanted me to be. So when I was pregnant with my son, I got out of that abusive situation. And I got involved with the women of the church when I first got pregnant at 14. I remember laying in bed one night, and I just prayed, God, find me someone to help me. And the next day I ran into an old coach of mine, which he used to have Bible verses plotted out for practice. And so I would go tear that page out to, just stump him so he didn't know what he was doing. I mean, we would swear at him. We were just horrible to this guy. So I walk in the restaurant the day after I pray this, and he goes, hey, Gina, you want to go to church? And I think he was expecting me to, spit on him because I did spit on him before. But I didn't spit on him. I said, yes, I really want to go. And so what happened when I joined this church is I had a group of women who took me in, and through my pregnancy and through the death of my child, Enria, I was taught how to make a budget a month, or a budget for the whole month on food stamps of how to do my food, and cooking and cleaning and care for my child. And so they were just absolutely wonderful to me and taught me a lot. But I also knew when I hit the age of 23, I kind of got away from those women. I started drinking with my friends, because what happens when you turn 21? Up before then, I was a Sunday school teacher, stayed at home with my kids. I was involved in Birth to 3. I was a part of the first pilot program for the Teen Birth to 3 program here in Springfield. So I had lots of connection to early intervention. I was involved in Head Start. Lots of supports as a parent, but when I turned 21, I was really angry over my divorce. And I looked at my life and I absolutely hated where I was. I was on cash assistance, living in subsidized housing. I had 3 kids and I just hated my life. So for me, I didn't know what that all meant, but I saw other people who owned their own homes and how happy they looked. And I was so sick of being dictated on, if you don't fill out your food stamps right, you don't get it, and then your family goes without food. If you have too many visitors at your house, you can lose your housing. So I started driving around Oak Ridge and getting addresses off of homes. And I'd call City Hall and say, if these houses, and I mean they should have been condemned houses, but I'm a dreamer. I've always been a dreamer. So I'd call the owners and say, hi, my name is Gina Baines, and I'd love to live in your house and fix it up. You know, and throughout the conversation, they find out I'm a single mom with 3 kids on welfare. And, you know, you could tell that it just went down the tubes really quickly. So one of my friends says, Gina, why don't you try for the St. Vincent de Paul program? They help you buy a house, and it's a first-time home buyers program. And so I signed up for that, and when I took that class, they said, well, you're too low income for our low-income housing. I'm like, what? And they said, well, your income is here, and the income you have to be is here. And I was like, well, how do I get to that income? And so she explained to me about you get a job, you work, this is how much you have to make to get into this place. I took 18 months of classes to work on my credit. I went out and got 3 jobs. And one of the jobs was Women's Space. And when I worked for Women's Space, they said, Gina, you're so good with people. Do a PD 100 and see if you can get a job at the state. So I had a friend who worked for the state help me do that. And so by the time I got into this brand new house that was built, I also got a job at DHS. I also joined what they call the working poor. And Rhea talks a lot more about that because she was a teenager. And so around that whole time, I finally got the job of my dreams. I was the working poor. But what led up to that is right before St. Vincent de Paul program, they had welfare to work. So I thought, this is perfect. This is exactly what I need. And I went to that orientation. The first woman who spoke said, you people no longer are going to sit on your butt and collect welfare. You have 2 years and you're off. I sunk down in my chair, and the only thing I could think of is we're going to be homeless. Me and my kids are going to be homeless. And I actually started thinking about what I could do because I know how to be homeless. And so, thank God, the second speaker was a radio announcer, not even in social services. And he started saying, who can make your food stamps last all month? And I'm like, oh, I can. And who can cut hair? And I'm like, well, I can. Granted, bowl cuts, but I did my kids' hair. Well, back then it was mullets. It was in the 90s. So my boys have mullets. My daughter and Rhea's bangs were, But so I'm like, I did. So he started talking about these transferable skills that we all should be teaching people, especially if I did not have a resume. My first resume had to be all my transferable skills, and I was a big volunteer in the schools because I wasn't about to let my daughter or my kids go to a school where I suffered a lot of abuse. I suffered as much abuse in the school as I did at home, which normally this is a 3-hour lecture, and I can't go into all that, but... So anyway, that whole St. Vincent de Paul program was my ray of hope. Because when I left that place, that radio announcer got me all excited like, that lady can just kiss my butt. No one's going to tell me what I can do. And I just kind of have that personality, like, who are you to tell me I can't do this? And so he really pumped a lot of us up. And I went out and got a little part-time job, but I still got cash assistance. So anyway, thank God for him. Thank God for the St. Vincent de Paul program that got me into my first home and brought my income up. And then I'll let Rhea pick up from there because when I started the working poor, that is when a lot of things changed for our family and I wasn't around for my kids. And so, but I want to introduce this documentary. So this whole presentation was my presentation, my senior project at the University of Oregon when I graduated. I wanted to get Donna Beagle to come out and speak, and then we found out how much it was to get her to come out and speak. And my daughter goes, "Mom, you have the exact same story. Why don't you do it?" And so Rhea did this presentation, and so we did what we're doing now 6 years ago. And so I talked to my brother and sister who their whole life have dealt with mental illness issues, alcoholism, and being homeless. And they were very gracious to let us videotape them and them to tell their story. And my brother who is speaking, after my brother Gordon died, real quickly I want to say, the brother above him, his name's Gerald, he's the one that saw him hanging in the park, and he could not handle being at home anymore. So he stole, my brother says it's a police boat, but it was a Forest Service boat and car, and was arrested doing that and he was incarcerated right after my brother's death. So I was left with one brother, the brother on this video. Before my brother's death, he was the big bully. Like when my mom left, I would be hogtied and put in the closet. Or I would have to be the one running with a ball and they would all tackle me. I mean, it was torture time. He was a bully. But miraculously, as soon as my brother died and my other brother left home, Gerald started being my mentor. He started talking to me about school. He started checking my homework and asking me if I had homework. We would sleep in the backyard, and he would start talking about dreaming. What kind of house do you want to live in? What kind of job do you want to do? Who do you want to be? You don't have to have an animal pooping and peeing in your house. And so he started me to be the dreamer that I am today. And he built a lot of resiliency in me. Every practice he had, because he went into athletics, he was a very good athlete, he took me to every practice. Matter of fact, he would practice plays with me, which wasn't so fun. But he really worked hard on being my mentor. And so this is him on the video, and then my older sister who was incarcerated when I was about 4. And then after that, Rhea's going to take over the floor.
All right. So that was made in 2010 when my mom was graduating from the FHS program. So some of the numbers in there are a little dated, but the numbers of children experiencing poverty I do not think has improved from then. So my name is Rhea, and I currently teach at the University of Oregon. I teach this material to students who are going to go into the future of being social workers or future educators. I supervise students who have internships in the community also. But previous to that, I worked for 5 years at Options Counseling Services, and I worked on a contract with child welfare. I've been to some CRB hearings, and so I'm very much familiar with what you all do in the process and some of those challenges, and I think this information will be very helpful. So one of the hugest differences in my mom and I's story, a big distinction, is that I experienced the poverty. I come from generational poverty, but I didn't experience the abuse and neglect, which is a very important thing to know. And it's important that we also keep in our mind that just because a family is experiencing poverty does not mean that abuse and neglect is happening in the home. And so I'm an example of that. And just to give a little definition of poverty, when we use the word poverty, it's a very diverse group of people. So my mom definitely comes from generational poverty, and we take the definition of Donna Beagle, where she clarifies that generational poverty means that there is no one in your family for generations who have had stable employment. It's usually piecework or working under the table or getting cash assistance from the government. The biggest thing is that you never have enough money to meet all of your basic needs. So it's never enough money to pay your utilities, your rent, your food. Just your basic survival needs are never met on a consistent basis. You also do not have a positive outlook on education, and you often don't have access to education. So I would say my life started out as living in generational poverty, but then we did transition to the working poor, which I'll talk more about as we get to that. So I didn't have the abuse and neglect. My mom had experienced a great deal of trauma in her life, but we had a lot of early intervention services, and that's a really key piece as to why I am where I'm at today in my life. My mom was part of the pilot program for Parenting Now, which was previously called Birth to 3. She also received prenatal care with me, which she did not receive with my older brother who passed away. She was connected with Early Head Start right away, and she had people doing home visits. But more importantly than just having those services, the service providers who were working with my mom were connecting with her and building a relationship with her, which we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of that, especially for folks who come from poverty, because they're typically very oral culture people. I didn't have the same amount of drug exposure that my mom had as a young kiddo. She was very healthy in her pregnancy, which is very unusual for my generation of my cousins and everyone. Typically people use drugs, if not drink, throughout their pregnancy and when they're nursing, and my mom did not do that because she had people showing her a different way and educating her about that. Let me go to my next slide here. Okay, not yet. We also lived in low-income housing, this apartment complex that my mom talked about. And the fact that we lived there until I was in 5th grade is almost unheard of for folks who are experiencing poverty. It's very common that you are evicted from your home because, again, you're not getting enough money to be able to meet your basic needs, so you're going from house to house to house or staying with family. So what happens in that process is things get left behind. It can be incredibly traumatizing for children. You're not forming connections. And people who live in poverty, often what's lacking, besides the obvious resources, is that sense of connectedness to community. And it's one of our most basic human needs, is to feel like we belong to a larger group and that we're accepted and that we have human connection. So I had a ton of that, especially my first 3 to 5 years. When we do an extended version of this lecture, we talk a lot about brain development, and we've cut some of that out today, but I'll just briefly say, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, that the first 3 to 5 years, having a parent who is emotionally present and having your basic needs met can make a very huge difference in your brain mapping. There's actually a lot of research that shows when people live in poverty and they are living without their basic needs being met, just like a child who's growing up in a war zone, that's why we call it the war zone of poverty, there's a lot of deficit that happens to the frontal lobe of the brain, a lot of connections that are not made. And the frontal lobe of our brain is what's responsible for things like impulse control, remembering what happened last time and making a different decision this time. So some really key pieces in our brain functioning that can be impacted when you're experiencing trauma and when you are not having your basic needs met on a consistent basis. And I don't share this to put blame on the parents, because what parent can be emotionally present for their child and be stable when they're trying to figure out where they're going to sleep, how they're going to get food, where they're going to get diapers? It's incredibly difficult, and it's not their fault. So I had a mom who was emotionally present. We had stable housing. She had these people coming into our home who were teaching her things about breastfeeding, about nutrition, that children should have, 3 to 4 meals a day, which she was shocked. She's like, really? I've never had 3 to 4 meals a day. So all of these things were happening all at the same time, which I can tell you from experience of being a home visitor these past 5 years in our community, it is incredibly difficult to get all of these wraparound services happening at the same time. So child welfare gets involved. They want A, B, C, D, E, F. I mean, sometimes they would send me these lists of all these things they want happening with this family. And we simply do not have the resources. The wait list in our community for low-income housing is years long. And so if you are a mom on TANF right now in our community, you can expect to make anywhere between $500 to $700 a month. can anyone think of a place to live that's less than $500 a month? I know of 3 places in Springfield where the rent is $525 a month. There's a few places where it's $400, but it's almost impossible to find housing. So if you don't have that low-income housing, you're homeless, or you're scraping together money by other means, sometimes illegal means, in order for your family to survive. So the fact that as a young person, we had these wraparound services and all these interventions happening simultaneously, which allowed, excuse me, which allowed for my mom to be emotionally present, is a huge factor in building resiliency with my family. So in 5th grade, when my mom did go through that program to buy her first home, thank you, I forgot my water. She was told that in order to qualify for this low-income home buyers program, your income's here, it needs to be up here for you to be at the poverty level. She was that far below the poverty level. So the reason for that, you guys all have a quiz on your table, and I really encourage you, it doesn't matter so much that you take the quiz and how you do on it, but read through that information as to why the questions are true or false, because one of the things you'll read about is that the formula that calculates our federal poverty guideline is a formula that was developed in the 1960s when our whole welfare reform programs were created. So it took the cost of food in the 1960s and it multiplied it times 3 because it assumed that a family spent 1/3 of their budget on food. So that's not the case today. Families don't spend 1/3 of their budget on food. A majority of a family's budget today is spent on housing and shelter. So they estimate that if we were to update the formula that calculates the poverty line, that it would almost triple the amount of families and children who are living in poverty who would qualify for services. So when we say the working poor, what that means is that people have employment, and they typically are making just enough money to not qualify for things like TANF or food stamps or Oregon Health Plan, but it's still actually not enough to cover the cost of housing, childcare, shelter, and so they still are going without their basic needs met. And so that was what happened in my mom's situation. So her life dream was to not be a welfare mom. She wanted to make it off of public assistance, out of low-income housing. She did that. She went out and got 3 jobs, and the only time we ever saw my mom was when she came home between jobs to change her uniform. So when she went from the pizza parlor to the meat department or the meat department to cleaning hotel rooms, that's when we got to see my mom. She would come home to have dinner with us, which I had prepared because I had taken on the role as a co-parent. This is what you guys read about in case files as being parentified. One of the strongest values I hold is that I helped raise my brothers, and we are incredibly close because of that, and I do not regret any of it. But I acted as a co-parent so that my mom I would be taking care of my brothers. She would come home to eat with us and ask us about our day. How was school? What did you learn today? How was, track practice? And as we're talking to her, she's falling asleep in her chair because she's working herself to the bone. And so we went from having this stay-at-home mom pretty much with our basic needs met when we were on public assistance to a mom who was not in the home as much, who was exhausted. And we made enough money to, live in a house and to not be on public assistance, but it still wasn't enough to meet our basic needs. And oftentimes my mom would come home and she wouldn't eat with us because there wasn't enough for her to eat. And she would say, oh, I already ate, don't worry about it. And what I know now as an adult is that she hadn't eaten and she was going without food so that we would have enough. And so that was really crushing. I think probably especially for my mom, it was heartbreaking for me to learn about as an adult that the American dream is false. It takes more than just hard work. And, I don't like people to hear our story and to walk away thinking, see, all you got to do is work hard. If you want it bad enough and if you work hard enough, you can do it, because that's not the case. People who are living in poverty who seek out employment with the level of skill they have and the level of education, they will get into a job where they will work hard their entire life and never get a raise. It'll never be enough to meet all their basic needs to live comfortably, and that has got to change. So we went from living in this community of mothers in low-income housing where everyone took care of each other, watched out for one another, it was a very oral culture way of living, to living in a house where we were much more isolated, didn't know our neighbors, didn't have as much support, not the same sense of community. But luckily, me and my brothers had that really stable foundation when we were very young, which made a huge difference. I also had amazing mentors as a young person. So my mom, I'm going to back up for a second and talk about another protective factor that my mom was able to incorporate in her parenting. We never knew when my mom was in a crisis. She had this amazing way to shield us from the crisis she might be experiencing. So, for instance, every summer, we would camp all summer long, and my brothers and I looked forward to it all year. We would talk about our campouts and what we were going to do, all of our plans for our forts, for who was going to get which tent, and what I learned as an adult when I was working in a homeless shelter and talking to my mom more about homelessness and families that camped a lot is that we were camping every summer because my mom would not pay any of her bills all summer. We would camp, and she would save up enough money to buy us school clothes and Christmas presents because she knew exactly what it took for us to fit in and to appear normal, and she wanted us to have the same life as everyone else. So she was incredibly creative as to how she would provide that to us. But she also, those camping trips were never her breaking down and panicking and being depressed. I'm sure she had days where she wasn't happy to be there, but she was able to hide that from us. And that's something that I would talk to families about when I worked in the home with families is how do you be in a crisis and shelter your children from that? Because again, children model they regulate their emotions based on their caregiver. So if they have a caregiver who's constantly in crisis, the child is also in crisis and develops mental health issues because of that. So that's another huge piece of my mom's parenting of how we were able to break a lot of the cycles in our family of mental health issues, of just being in crisis. So when I refer to mentorship, we're going to define mentorship a little bit more because I think traditionally we think of mentorship as some really nice program where mentors go and they get trained and then they're matched up with somebody and they mentor them, which is great. It's definitely a great program, any program that does that. But when we talk about mentorship, we're talking about a way of being with people in your everyday life, everywhere you go. And so I had mentors, for example, there was a grant through Lane Arts Council that would employ middle school, junior high age kids to work in summer camps with younger children who were taking art classes. So I was elected as part of this grant to participate, and I had local artists in our community who would teach me, the different things they were going to teach these small children. So I had some one-on-one attention from an adult who was telling me how great I was and how talented I was. Then when the children came to be in the summer school, they picked up really quickly that I was really good with kids, especially the kids that were really difficult to handle. My younger brother has autism, and so I was very skilled at how to redirect kids, how to re-engage them, if they were overwhelmed, how to give them a break. And so as a 12, 13-year-old kid, I was being teamed up as a one-on-one aide with the more challenging kids in this program. And I was getting a ton of positive reinforcement from the adults in the environment saying, you are gifted. And so I went on to get my master's in early childhood special ed, and part of that is due to that mentorship I got as a really young person. And when you are living in poverty, typically people are not pointing out what's good about you. You're going to school, you're going out into the world, you're watching TV, and you're constantly getting messages that people who are poor are. Does anybody want to yell out some really terrible stereotypes our culture holds? That you're lazy, you're less than, you're stupid, you're promiscuous, you're a slut, you don't care, that you should just work harder. So that's the process of internalizing poverty. Internalizing poverty means that, think of my mom as a 4- and 5-year-old going to people's homes and going to the school and feeling rejected. Now, when you're 4 and 5, you don't have the capacity to step back and see this larger context of this is a cultural issue. These are values being placed on me. That's not who I am. When you're that age, geez, when you're a teenager, when you're an adult, and you get those messages, you internalize, well, something must be wrong with me. I must just be a bad person. My family's a bad person. We don't work hard enough. And so that is one of the hugest barriers that keeps people stuck in poverty, is they have internalized it as a personal deficiency, something that's wrong with them. There's the term immigrant poverty. Now, part of the reason this is getting to be a lot harder, but historically, people can come here from other countries and be in poverty, and they can oftentimes make it out in one generation. Their children become business owners, their children go to college. Part of the reason for that is they haven't internalized the poverty as something that's wrong with them. They just came from a country where that was the experience of everybody in that culture. So it's not because they're stupid or lazy or dumb. It's because they just came from a country where it was impoverished. And so that's an example of the difference between internalizing poverty, and that's one of the biggest obstacles in our culture. So I did not internalize poverty. I had adults in my life who were seeing my strengths, who were telling me on a regular basis, who were also connecting me with other mentoring adults. I had coaches who said that I was very talented and gifted. And my mom made sure that when we went to school, we looked a certain way and behaved a certain way so that we were accepted at school, especially by our teachers. And part of the reason my mom was able to be involved in my education is because of Head Start. We just got back from a statewide conference in Bend yesterday with Head Start, and I cannot tell you how amazing that program is, because besides providing education services to children who are living in poverty, they take a whole family approach, and they connect the family to ways of accessing food, helping them with housing if that's a barrier, but they encourage the families to be involved in their child's educational experience. And for most families that live in poverty, the education world is not a place you go to. It's not an accepting place. You don't feel encouraged or supported when you go there. So for Head Start to do this with families is such a huge piece, because we know from research that if families are involved in their child's education, their children will be more successful and will go much further in their education. So that was the case for me. My mom went through a lot of healing when she was involved in Head Start, because she got to go to an educational setting and see that it was a safe place, and she felt comfortable with me going there. And she also learned that she could advocate for her children, and that it was okay for her to question authority and educators and say, I don't think that's a good fit for my child, or why is that happening? So I was very empowering for my mom. So I'm going to spend a second talking about oral and print culture. I unfortunately did not learn about this until I was in graduate school. Would have been really helpful to know before I went to college. When I went to college was my first time I ever experienced going to a place where I felt stupid. I didn't talk like other people. I did not feel like I belonged. I had a hard time finding anybody that had very much in common with me. I looked a lot like the other college students. I was very much a non-traditional college student. I was the first in my family to ever go to college. So it was my first time being submersed in a middle to upper class world, and the norms were very different. This is due to oral and print culture. So again, they do not always go hand in hand, but typically when people are living in poverty, they are more oral culture type folks. We learn print skills, and print culture comes from the education system. It also requires, in order to survive in poverty, being more oral culture is what helps you to survive. So oral culture is the culture that we all are born with as humans. In oral culture, you seek out advice, ways to live your life, what to do in any circumstance. You seek out information from people that you know and trust and have a relationship with. Your highest value is placed on people and relationships more than anything else. With print culture, you seek out information on how to live your life from professionals, from research, from researching something online or articles. So if a perfect stranger comes to you and they're a doctor and they give you advice on something, you take it pretty seriously. Whereas in oral culture, if you don't know that person and you don't feel some sort of connection to them and they don't seem like a real person to you, you don't take their advice and apply it most of the time. So if you have a child that's out of control, that you don't know you're not sure what to do with them, everyone you know and what everyone's telling you is spank them. Put hot sauce in their mouth, put soap in their mouth. That's what you do to deal with that. So that's what you do. Not because you're a bad parent or because you want to hurt your children, but because the people you know and trust, who you value more than anything in the world, are telling you that's how you need to deal with that. So another thing about oral culture is you're very spontaneous, which you kind of have to be when you live in poverty. You never know what's going to happen. Your environment's very unpredictable and oftentimes chaotic, so you have to be able to be spontaneous. You have to be able to deal with things as they come because you never know what's going to be happening. Repetition is very important in oral culture. Storytelling is important. So when I was in college, I really struggled academically. I hadn't been in a very rigorous academic setting in high school. I don't remember ever having homework my senior year. I stopped taking math my sophomore year because they didn't offer the higher class, the next class up, because not enough people needed to take it. So I remember having to sit down and read, 50, 60 pages in a night. I couldn't read something, stop reading, and tell you what I had just read about. But if I read out loud or if I talked about it with somebody, then I could remember it. How many of you have had that experience? So that's something to do with oral culture. So I was feeling pretty out of place, and then I took a class with a professor. His name's Dan Close. He's retired since then. But he started, this class was for future educators and human service workers. He would start every class out with a family story, a story about a family situation. And they usually sounded pretty similar to my family situation, which was the first time in this setting that anybody was talking about anything that was relevant to my life. So I glommed onto it, I was like, does he know my family? I can't believe this guy, this professor is talking about this kind of stuff. And it was a story, so he would tell a story of a family, and then he would start connecting all the research, all the theory behind it, and then I could apply it because it was applicable to my life, and there was examples of it. So I learned in graduate school, I read Donna Beagle's book, which I would definitely suggest to anybody. It's called See Poverty, Be the Difference. Great book. A lot of what we're talking about she covers in her book. I learned about oral and print culture and was like, oh, that is why college was so hard for me at first, is because I was very oral culture. I had to be in study groups where we talked about these different theories. I would go to my professor's office hours and explain to them why I didn't understand something, and then as I was explaining it, oh, okay, I guess I understand this. My mom and I still, when we're preparing for lectures, we'll sit down at the computer to try and update PowerPoints, and we end up talking for 2 hours. We get so frustrated because nothing gets done on the computer, but then once she goes, then I sit in the computer and I can kind of bring it all back together. But oral and print culture is pretty fascinating to read about, but it explains a lot of the behaviors behind when people are living in poverty, some of the choices they're making. If you're someone who comes from more middle to upper class, you're very print culture, it just doesn't make any sense to you. For example, how many of you noticed in the video that how nice my aunt's nails were? She had really nice manicure, right? So this is something I hear all the time. Well, how can they be on welfare or cash assistance, but their nails are done all the time? Or their kids have Nike shoes, or they have big screen TVs, or they're driving a nice car. Well, in order to feel like you belong in our society, in order to feel accepted, those are the things that you have to have. And you have to remember that that is a basic human need, is to feel like you belong to a group, especially for your children to feel like they belong to a group. So you will get really creative and find ways to have those things. And it's actually not hard to have big screen TVs and leather couches and really nice cars, because you can go to errands, you can go to all kinds of rent-to-own places, and you hear it on the radio, no job, no credit, you're approved. I mean, they will give people all of these things, but then they're going to make monthly payments on it, and they're going to pay 10 times what it's worth. And if you are one payment away from paying off your entire furniture set and your TV, and you miss that payment, they will come to your door, take your entire front room out, and you get nothing. You don't get credited. You don't get to make a late payment. And so these are part of the systems that keep people in poverty, because if they didn't have to pay 10 times for that TV, or, so there's reasons why all of these things exist and what keeps people trapped. But remembering that people need to feel like they belong is a very basic human need. So we have an activity, and I think now would be a good time for us to do it. Do you want to add anything so far? Or usually at this point we kind of merge together and share more together. Is there anything I've left out or anything we need to add?
You got it.
Okay. So on your tables, so we've shared a lot about our family, about our experience. I have no doubt that there's people in this room who might have a similar experience or come from that sort of background. For a lot of you, this might be really mind-blowing to hear about a family story like ours. We want to have an activity and give opportunity for all of you to do some self-reflecting as to where you come from and how that experience may have shaped your values and how you view the world. So we have this activity called the class continuum. Typically, we stand up and are in a line and we step forward and backward, and this is an activity that we do that way. Because of time and how many people we have, we've tried to adapt this. You guys will see on your tables that there is a larger paper with lines on it. We are going to be reading a series of statements, and you will be hypothetically taking steps forward and backward on this grid. Everyone is going to end up, spread out across a continuum. But to answer these questions, it requires some self-disclosure. And when I'm reading out these statements, you need to be thinking about what your experience was from the time you were born until you were 18 years old. So a lot of people may have grown up very privileged, upper class, and then as adults experienced poverty. So this is focusing on your childhood experience, because your childhood experiences is really what kind of shapes your lens of how you view the world, and it's a lot of our most deep-seated views of who we are in the world come from our childhood experiences. So I want you to make sure you focus on from the time you were born until you were 18. I also want to give permission for everybody in this room, regardless of where you end up on this continuum, that we all have the right to feel proud of where we come from, that this is not an activity to make anybody feel ashamed of who you are, and because we're just born into our families. I mean, we don't get to choose where we go and what those people are like. We are all just born into this world, and what you got is what you got. So, and that's something we'll talk about when we debrief. But if anybody does not feel comfortable doing this, you absolutely do not have to. What we're hoping is to do this activity on the paper and then for you guys to kind of discuss it in groups at your tables. So I'm going to pull up the questions. Yeah, so people will probably need to share this larger piece of paper. There's not enough for every person to have one. So does everyone have the paper out and have a pen? On the paper, there's a starting line. And then as I'm reading statements, you're going to be making marks either forward or backward. Okay, I'm going to get started. So pay attention just in the first few questions about education, how much movement you have based on these questions. Your mother was college educated. Move 4 steps forward. Moving up. Yes, sorry. Just attended college. Yes, good question. Your grandmother was college educated. Move 3 steps forward. Move 3 steps up from the line. If your mother or grandmother did not go to college, you would not move at all. You would stay on the start line. Yes. Your father was college educated. Move 2 steps forward. Your father was college educated. Move 2 steps forward. Your grandfather was college educated. Move 2 steps forward. You knew someone who benefited from education. Move 2 steps forward. So if you knew someone who went to college, or even if you knew people in your life who went to school and enjoyed it and encouraged other people to go, that is a privilege. Move 2 steps forward. Before the age of 18. You felt your teachers cared about you. Move 2 steps forward. You did not know anyone who had a job beyond minimum wage or piecework, like working in fields, babysitting. Move 2 steps backward if you did not know anybody who had a job beyond minimum wage or piecework. 2 steps back or down on the paper from 0 to 18. You saw someone in your family being disrespected by a professional. 2 steps back, 2 steps down on the paper. You saw someone in your family being disrespected by a professional. 2 steps back. You had a regular family doctor. 1 step forward. You had a regular allowance that allowed you to spend money as you wished. 1 step forward. Before the age of 18, you had an allowance. You had a job in high school and some or all of your wages went toward family expenses. 1 step back. You lived in a mobile home. 2 steps backward. Your family occasionally or frequently relied on pawn shops to raise cash. 1 step back. Did I? Oh, your parents paid for private tutoring in addition to your regular schooling. 2 steps forward. Yeah. You had your own bedroom by yourself. 1 step forward. You did not have money to purchase basic toiletries like soap, shampoo, conditioner, toilet paper. 2 steps back. Your family did not have money to. You shared a sleeping space with one or more sibling or family member on a regular basis for a year or more. 1 step back for each person besides you who stayed in the room. You did not have to get a job in high school, so whether you had one or not, you did not have to get one. 1 step forward. You grew up going short on medical care. 1 step back. There was an expectation in your family that you and your siblings would go to college. 1 step forward. Your family had more than one working car most of the time. 1 step forward. You grew up having to go hungry some of the time. 1 step backward. You lived in public housing and or received food stamps that were critical to making ends meet. 1 step back. You grew up using language or grammar that did not match what was expected of you in school. 1 step back. You grew up using language or grammar that did not match what was expected of you in school. 1 step back. You stayed at destination resorts 2 or more times. 1 step forward. You were left alone for long periods of time before you were 7, one step back. You experienced teasing or fear of being left out because of the clothes that you wore, your personal hygiene, or your manners, one step back. Your family owned a car less than 4 years old, one step forward. So your family had a newer car, less than 4 years old. Move one step forward at any time before the age of 18. You wore hand-me-down clothes, not because it was chic or in style. One step back. Your family ever had its utilities cut off for non-payment. 2 steps backward. Your family decided, because of lack of money, not to get some elective form of medical dental care for a family member. 1 step backward. Your family had and used credit cards. 1 step forward. You or other family members worked at manual labor or in the fields. 2 step backward. So any kind of like factory work, working in the fields, picking fruit. Your family members used public transportation out of necessity. 1 step back. You traveled out of the country for vacation and stayed with non-relatives. So if you traveled out of the country to visit family, this is not referring to that. This is you traveled out of the country for vacation. 1 step forward. Your family was on welfare for more than 1 year. 1 step back. Your family owned the house in which you were raised. 1 step forward. Your family was considered middle class. 1 step forward. Your family was ever evicted from a house or apartment for non-payment of rent. 1 step back for each eviction. You lived and or slept in a car for a year or more. 2 steps back. You did not know what a food stamp looked like. 1 step forward, when they used to actually be food stamps. You lived in the same community most or all of your childhood. 1 step forward. Oh, yes, okay. You moved once or more a year, and the moves were not related to a family member being in the military. 1 step backward. Your family took regular vacations. 1 step forward. Your family hoarded or stored canned food for fear of not having enough. 1 step back. Your family benefited or expected to benefit from an inheritance. 1 step forward. Your family paid your bills on time. 1 step forward. Your family bought clothes and goods at secondhand stores out of necessity. 1 step back. Your family had a professional to do your taxes and or provide professional advice. 1 step forward. You lived the majority of the time in rental housing. 1 step back. Your family purchased original art from a gallery. 1 step forward. You were homeless at some point for 2 months or longer. 1 step back. You had 2 or more bathrooms in your place of residence. 2 steps forward. Your family used check cashing stores. So this is meaning they didn't have a bank account. 2 steps backward. You traveled out of state for pleasure. 1 step forward. Your family was regularly denied credit. 1 step back. Regularly denied credit. 1 step back. Your family didn't own a car because you were unable to buy one. 1 step back. Your family had debts in a collection agency over $500. 1 step back. Your family had a first-name friend who was a medical doctor, lawyer, or judge. One step forward. Your family had a first-name friend, someone you knew, who was unwillingly unemployed for over a year, so could not find a job for over a year. One step back. So take a look at where you ended up on this continuum. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to kind of talk amongst yourselves because you probably have some thoughts, and then we'll come back together.
They're supposed to be doing that while the activities.
Oh, everyone did it on their own piece of paper.
However they wanted to do it, they were supposed to do it on the big piece of paper. These people over here were using the big piece of paper.
That's good. Switched up the slides. So do you want me up here now, or are you going to go through the rest?
I think if you are up here, that would be good. We have less than 10 minutes, so.
Oh, I think I'll just let you sum it up then.
Okay. I'm just going to talk about mentorship and then
Ask if they have questions. Maybe I'll sit here for
I don't
questions.
think we can do questions with not in 10 minutes with the size of the group.
So you've already mentioned mentorship already.
Well, we haven't talked
Oh,
about.
you did this. Okay. Nice if we had it just.
Can't really do question and answer. This is like another like keynote address where it's like it just isn't really because people with this kind of topic they want to process more. They want to, and it's not like quick. You know,
Well, and plus we can't even stick around, can we?
we can't. If we go over, we cut into their break before they go to their breakout sessions. So.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm just going to sit down then and let you finish it up since it's only
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to have us come back together. I really hope that this activity sparks and fuels a conversation that you continue to have throughout the rest of the day. I just want to ask, we don't have a lot of time to discuss this as much as I would like to, but I do want to know how many of you in the room were surprised at where you ended up with this activity? How many of you were surprised at where you ended up on this continuum? Like either you were way further ahead than you thought you would be, or you were further back than maybe you thought you would be? Yeah. Sometimes, some of the things that are read out in this, you hear it and you think, I didn't realize that was a privilege. You know, that just seemed like a normal way of living. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, so she's referring to the question of you considered yourself middle class, and that has really changed over time, what's considered middle class and what life means for folks who live in middle class. That's very true. There's also people in this room who may have been around and experienced the Great Depression, and that's situational poverty, and even that experience is very different. So if your family hoarded canned food, that was pretty normal at a time in our history because of the Great Depression. It was considered very normal to do that. So that's a great point to bring up. The other thing I want to point out is that sometimes people will end up at the very front and really struggle with that because they did not feel privileged as a young person growing up. So there's things that this does not ask, like, did you have any parents with drug or alcohol addiction? Did your family abuse you? And so this very much just focuses on financial resource dependent sorts of things. So I do want to validate that for a lot of people that you may have stuck out in this activity as a very privileged person, and that may not be your self-concept of who you are. And so this does not, there are other activities that plays into it. This is not one of them, but that's something important to recognize. So I want to just put this up here for a quick second, and I talked about this earlier when I spoke about internalizing poverty. When you think of some of those statements and experiences people are having, this is what poverty teaches. These are the kind of messages that you internalize when you experience that life often, that you have nothing to offer, that you're not smart, that you're in a war zone and you need to survive, that you have to do and say whatever it takes to survive, even if that's lying about your income so that you can still receive food stamps. Even if you only get a few dollars in food stamps, it still qualifies, especially your children, for a lot of other programs like free and reduced lunch. And so it's easy for us to see things that people are doing, like selling their food stamps for cash or doing things illegal, and to want to judge them and point the finger. But if you were in their situation and you were trying to survive and figure out how to feed your children or how to provide for your family or how to keep your housing, absolutely you would say, and you have no support. That's the other piece, is most of us, if we think of being in that position of not knowing where you're going to get food or where you're going to stay, your first thought is, I would call my sister, or I would call my mom, or most of us have a very large support network of people we can fall back on. When you're living in poverty, everyone else you know is living in poverty, or your family is so dysfunctional and unsafe that you can't depend on them. I was not raised around my mom's brothers and sisters and their children because really unhealthy, scary things were happening in their home, and my mom wanted to distance us from that. If you are silent or give off an aura of violence, people might leave you alone. This is definitely the case for my uncles. That's how they made it through and got out of their house, is by just being bigger and badder than everyone else. My uncle, who is in that documentary, is currently incarcerated for pulling a gun on a police officer. So these are all survival strategies that you learn really quickly how to adapt to your environment in order to survive. And the reason I share this is not to make excuses for people or say that what people are doing are okay, but if we are approaching people with judgment, people know that, and that's not what makes change. What needs to happen is we need to fight the poverty, not the people. We need to really look at these systems and look at these larger systems that keep people in poverty and keep them in situations where they have to lie and be violent and hide. Those are the things that need to be fixed, not pointing the finger at the people and saying, well, you just need to try harder, you need to be a better parent, you need to do this. When you don't have your basic needs met, you're not in a position to change. You're not in a position to self-reflect and to try and learn new ways of thinking and behaving and acting. You are trying to survive. So the answer to that is, for those of us who have our basic needs met, who have the resources and connections to make change in our community, we need to be the ones to step up and look at these systems and figure out how to make change. It's not people who are starving and homeless. It's not their job to fix all of this. Mentorship, real quick before we go to the break. There's this great research that Donna Beagle did, how the poor get to college. She went to colleges and found non-traditional college students who came from generational poverty, first in their family to ever go to college, and did interviews to figure out, how did you get here? Every single one of them had mentors. And they didn't say I had a mentor, but they described these different people in their lives at crucial times that helped them. And the more mentors they had and the longer the relationship, the higher degree they got when they went to college. If they had mentors prior to 6th grade, they typically would make it to private elite universities. Anyone can be a mentor. So these are comments from the research participants. This is what happened This is what these people did that qualified as mentorship. Went above and beyond to make me feel special, made me feel more confident, did not judge me for my poverty circumstances. They believed there was a way out for me. They talked with me when there were barriers. They introduced me to others who supported my education. They helped me access resources to meet my basic needs, and they cared about my family too. So they weren't just, let's save the kid, let's do this it was a whole family approach of, tell me about your mom and dad, or tell me about your brothers and sisters, here's something for them too. So this is, I mean, how many of you look at this list and feel like that's something I could do? This is the way that we interact with people in our community on a daily basis, because I guarantee, regardless of who you are, when you are out in the world, you have interactions with people who feel hopeless and desperate and like life is never going to change for them. And sometimes all it takes is recognizing someone, making them feel special, and making them feel like you care, that really can make the difference for somebody. And part of oral culture, people, in order to change the way you live your life, you have to make connections with people who are living a different way and have it modeled for you. And so the way that you make those connections with folks is you have to become a real person. You have to share who you are, something about yourself, in order for someone to feel connected to you and to take advice from you or to seek out information from you. So how do we advocate for children, and how do we support the entire family? In the system with child welfare, families are punished for not having skills that maybe have never been modeled to them. They are being punished for trying to navigate a road that they have absolutely no map for. They've never seen anyone do it a different way. They don't have anyone in their neighborhoods doing it a different way. And families sometimes don't have homes, oftentimes don't have homes that meet middle-class standards. So for example, I had a family I worked with, and the caseworker didn't want kids coming home because she didn't have a changing table for the baby. So in her world, that's what a prepared home that's ready to take care of a family, that's what it looks like. And so really, people have got to be educated about what are your own values and what is normal in your world, and what actually constitutes a safety concern. What is going to be more traumatizing for children? To not be in their home because it's dirty, or to be in foster care with a stranger? I mean, I think we really have got to take a look at our standards of what constitutes children being in the home versus out of the home, and how do we teach these skills to families without shaming them or making them feel like they have to lie because they're being judged. So what works? Mentorship, building on strengths. Remember, when you're in poverty, no one's ever telling you what you're doing right, what's good about you. So that's a great start, is to build on strengths. Meet people's basic needs, provide access to services. You know, that report that's giving feedback to child welfare. I mean, how many of you hear that report that she was just reading? My thoughts are, I can't believe we're not doing that. How are we sending traumatized kids to foster homes and they're not being educated about reactive attachment disorder? Because I guarantee almost every kid that comes in their home has it. So we have got to do better. We have got to, of course there should be a staff person that just works on retention of foster parents and makes them feel prepared and appreciated. I mean, that seems like 101 to me. Poverty competency. What does poverty teach? What keeps people in poverty? And then fighting the poverty, not the people. This is a poem we end with. It's by Donna Beagle. I would really encourage you to Google Donna, check out her website. This is really sums up a lot of what we've discussed. Thank you so much for having us. And I'll leave some business cards up here if anyone wants to follow up with an email, if you have questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gina and Ria. So you have about 10 minutes to get to the breakout sessions. There are 4 options for you. We will be drawing some tickets during the next session, so if you have any last tickets to put in, and the rest will be drawn at lunch. We'll see you at lunch. Thank you.